Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the security panel of the 13th China-US Symposium. My name is Jason Fan, and I'm currently a sophomore studying quantitative economics and international relations at Tufts University. Today, I'll be moderating the security panel with the help from my colleague Artem, who is a sophomore studying biomedical engineering and is interested in the economics and the politics of Southeast Asia. Over the past decade, China has built a blue water fleet of advanced destroyers and aircraft carriers. The PLA Navy is now the largest in the world in terms of vessel numbers and has become more active than ever. In the South China Sea, the country claims 62% of the water through its so-called Nine Dash Line. Although the claim was refuted by an UNCLOS ruling in 2016, China rejected the arbitration and has since expanded its presence in the South China Sea through assertive Coast Guard patrolling and building new artificial islands and military facilities. Elsewhere, Chinese companies are building or funding maritime infrastructure in many strategically located developing countries under President Xi Jinping's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. This panel will discuss China's maritime strategy and naval expansion and their implications to neighboring countries and the United States. We are honored to have four distinguished panelists with us today. Artem, why don't you start the introduction of panelists?
Sure. Thank you, Jason. So we will start with Dr. Colin Coxswain, who is a research fellow at Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, a constituent unit of S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, based in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He is especially interested in researching naval affairs in Indo-Pacific, focusing on Southeast Asia in particular, and generally issues related in naval technologies, naval modernization, naval arms control, and the offense-defense theory. Colin is also a coordinator of the US program at RSIS. Besides research and teaching, Colin also contributes his perspective to various local international media outlets, including BBC, Bloomberg, Channel News Asia, Reuters, and the Strain Times. In addition, Colin participates in activities with geopolitical risk consultancies, Oxford Analytica, and Wikistrat. And Colin is actually joining us from Singapore, which we really appreciate you staying this late with us. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Maya Nowens, who is a senior fellow for Chinese defense policy and military modernization at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is IISS. Prior to that, she worked at the European External Action Service as a policy officer in Taipei, Taiwan, and as a trade analysis in the EU delegation to New Zealand. She has previously worked in the private sector, consulting firms and international organizations on topics of foreign policy, security, and defense. Maya's expertise lies in Chinese cross-service defense analysis, Chinese defense industry and innovation, as well as China's regional strategic affairs and international relations. She is a co-lead of Chinese Security Project with the Mercator Institute for China Studies and leads IISS research on China's digital Silk Road. Yeah. And I leave it to you, Jason.
Thank you, Artem. Professor Robert Ross is Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Associate John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, Harvard University. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1984. He has taught at Columbia University and at the University of Washington, and in 1989 was a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. In 1994 to 1995, he was Fulbright professor at the Chinese Foreign Affairs College. In 2003, he was a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of International Strategic Studies, Tsinghua University, Beijing, and in 2014 was visiting scholar, School of International Relations, Peking University. In 2009, he was visiting scholar, Institute for Strategy, Royal Danish Defence College. From 2009 to 2014, he has been adjunct professor, Institute for Defense Studies, Norwegian Defense University College. His research focuses on Chinese security policy and defense policy, East Asian security, and US-China relations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Ross. Next, we have Professor Rockford Weitz, who is a professor of practice and director of the Maritime Studies program at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. From 2008 to 2013, he served as founding CEO at Carbometrics, leading the effort to build a VC-backed financial technology business that started in his Cambridge apartment. Prior to co-founding Carbometrics, he was a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Maritime Studies, a team leader of Fletcher's Abu Dhabi project, a fellow at Fletcher's Maritime Studies program, and a fellow at Fletcher's Jepson Center for Counterterrorism Studies. He has taught courses in jurisprudence, maritime security, and global maritime affairs at the Fletcher School, and published OPEDs in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Straits Times, among others. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Weitz. So the panelists will present in alphabetical orders. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes for presentation. Once the presentations end, panelists will have a chance to address each other's remarks. After that, I will ask a guiding question to the panel for discussion. We highly encourage the audience to send their questions to the Q&A function anytime during the panel. The last 20 minutes of the panel will be used for Q&A. Dr. Colin, the floor is now yours.
Can you hear me? All good? Okay, yeah, great. Thank you so much for inviting me. For this very short presentation, I'm going to just simply focus on one aspect of the Chinese maritime strategy. I'll be talking largely about the China Coast Guard law that was recently being unveiled earlier this year. I think it's important perhaps for me to raise a few remarks related to the context for better understanding of the Coast Guard law in order for everybody to better comprehend what is the potential ramifications for regional security. So after my presentation, I'll be more than happy to also touch on the other issues during the Q&A. Now, I think firstly is that the Coast Guard law that was being promulgated earlier this year was actually much in the media limelight. I mean, for some very I would say understandable reasons, because of the fact that some of the issues were considered rather ambiguous. In particular, the mention about waters under Chinese jurisdiction, that particular clause had in fact created much of the media commentary so far with respect to what extent China will apply the Coast Guard law and in what area of responsibilities that we are talking about. And by the extension, most people will be referring to or interpreting the Coast Guard law as applying to, for example, the waters enclosed within the 9-line in the South China Sea, and that necessarily also overlaps into the other coastal states, EEZ. So this is one aspect that has been raised in the media commentary, and the second has also been the issue of the use of force. I think it's important to put a context here that a number of Coast Guard laws around the world will have provisions that relate to the use of force. So to that extent, that isn't exactly anything novel for the Chinese. But the issue here is if you compare the draft that was unveiled much earlier last year, and you compare it with the approved draft by MPC this year, it's very clear that there are some restrictions that were earlier proposed were being removed. For example, in the draft, there was much mention about though the Coast Guard personnel will fire, they shall not fire underneath the waterline of the foreign vessel. But this particular clause was being removed. in the approved draft. And this seems to give the interpretation that Coast Guard personnel out there, they could potentially use force according to their own discretion, and that actually creates grounds for concerns. So these two are the key issues I believe are of particular note for the Coast Guard law. But I think it's important to highlight that beyond that, it's important to look at the context here. The context here is that for a number of years, especially we're talking about ever since China merged the various discrete maritime law enforcement agencies together under a unified Coast Guard a number of years back, there had been quite a bit of debate within the Coast Guard community regarding the difficulties they face when they conduct their maritime law enforcement, or broadly speaking, maritime sovereignty and rights protection out there in the South China Sea in particular. One of the complaints is that first, they always, most of the time, they will actually encounter not a rival Coast Guard vessel out there. Most of the time, they will encounter a rival's naval vessel, and that actually puts them at disadvantage. Or so they claim that they were put in a disadvantage, notwithstanding the fact that a number of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels are actually larger and in some respects better equipped than the rival Southeast Asian Navy's patrol assets. So that is one aspect that has been raised within the Chinese Coast Guard community. The second, I think that actually could help explain why there has been a shift towards looking at Coast Guard law, is also the fact that when all these agencies come together, they actually come without a unified legislative mechanism. So they have discrete mechanisms that deals with different things. For example, one mechanism that deals with, say, marine environment, and another mechanism that deals with another aspect of the maritime law enforcement. So what they want to do is to have a one-stop legislative mechanism that could potentially allow them to deal with many issues. So in a way, we're looking at what we call an omnibus type of agreement or legislative mechanism. So that is the second concerns and what we call internal domestic issues that they're talking about when they have the Coast Guard law. And of course, the other one is more of an organizational issue, that when they formed the Coast Guard, after 2015, I think it's important to note that the Coast Guard wants to be seen as the foremost maritime security institution, and having a Coast Guard law to them will be a way to assert themselves as an institution. So there are those domestic context that we have to consider here when the China Coast Guard law was being implemented. But be that as it may, I think one thing is that while the international community may come gradually to understand the domestic context that underpins the Coast Guard law, it's important to look at the ramification. I think much of what has been talked about would be to what extent the Coast Guard law will actually alter China's behavior. My argument is that we're not really looking at the Coast Guard law altering China's behavior. I think more importantly is how the Coast Guard law could alter the other rival states' behavior in the South China Sea, for example, or in the East China Sea with Japan. In a way, the Coast Guard law will be designed to create what I would deem as a sense of self-deterrence. It is part of the lawfare or gray zone strategy, where the more important thing is not to actually go to conflict, and best as possible, nobody ought to fire a shot. And these would potentially weigh very heavily in the minds of rivals out there in the South China Sea. For example, with the assumption that if they ever take action, for example, against Chinese fishermen, and they might potentially invite a retaliation from China, and thereby deters them from taking action. So I think that is the end result of what the Coast Guard law, or one of the objectives that the Coast Guard law was designed to achieve, actually. Not so much, trying to, encourage, the Chinese maritime law enforcement agencies to take action at the first instance. But of course, the law itself will provide the provisions to use force when necessary. So I think that is something that I believe is a more important ramification for the region. So with that, I think I probably exhausted almost 10 minutes of the time. And I look forward to the discussion with our fellow panelists and everyone later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colin. Now we'll go to Ms. Nowens.
Thank you very much, Jason. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the PLA's modernization, how the Navy fits within that, and relate some of my comments more particularly towards a Taiwan contingency, and lastly touch upon some realistic limitations of how non-regional powers, such as from the European Union, European Union member states, I should say rather, could play a role in the future. So we know that China has in 2015 begun a new round of military modernization efforts, according to Xi's goals that he set out at the 19th Party Congress in October 2017. China aims to have a fully modernized armed forces by 2035 and a fully fledged global top-tier military by 2050 that's capable of fighting and winning wars. And within the PLA's modernization and recent reforms, I think most importantly to our discussion today is the shift in the PLA's priority domains. So land no longer outweighs the sea, and in the minds of the PLA, China's critical security domains are instead in outer space, cyberspace, and of course in the maritime domain. And she has made it clear that for China to achieve its China dream of national rejuvenation by 2049, China will require a strong military that's commensurate with its size as a great power that can project power globally and protect its interests as well. But national rejuvenation, of course, also rests upon one other thing, and that's the reunification of Chinese territory. And what we should read here, of course, importantly, is the issue of Taiwan. The PLA thus have been and continue to be focused on a Taiwan mission if peaceful reunification can't be achieved. And I would say at this point, it seems extremely unlikely that peaceful reunification will be achieved. Military intimidation hasn't worked, economic incentivization hasn't worked, economic coercion or diplomatic pressure have not moved the Taiwanese public opinion closer to the idea of abandoning the status quo and accepting a Hong Kong-style one country, two systems solution. And indeed, I would argue that what we've seen in Hong Kong last year and the passing of the national security law makes this almost entirely off the table from Taiwanese perspective. So the PLA Navy and other PLA forces that play a role in maritime contingency, thus I think have been and will continue to receive heavy prioritization within the PLA in years to come. So what capabilities has the PLA been developing? And we know that the PLA has been developing a range of new capabilities to modernize its fleet and new platforms to modernize its fleet, to project more power, more effective power for key flashpoints around territorial integrity within its near seas, as well as to project power further afield from China's shores through building a blue water navy. We can think, for example, to look at its numbers of intermediate range ballistic missiles, its anti-ship missiles in particular, its fifth generation fighter aircraft, which are increasingly offensive in nature, its aircraft carriers, its submarine building program, and of course, a huge investment in its naval platforms and systems as well. I think it's difficult, therefore, to underestimate or understate, rather, the PLA Navy's modern shipbuilding acquisition of recent years, supported by a significant and in some ways very impressive domestic shipbuilding capacity. Since the 1990s, China's naval shipyards have produced a large range of different vessel types, improving on their predecessors. More recently, shipyards, of course, in the last few years have settled on newer designs like the Type 52 destroyers. And just to put this into numbers, since 2014, China launched 14 of these ships according to the 2021 IISS Military Balance Book. And that's twice as many Type 52 destroyers, or twice as many as the UK Royal Navy's total number of destroyers. Furthermore, the most prevalent vessel built in terms of individual hulls to date for the PLA Navy has been the Type 56 Jiangdao corvette, of which 28 were launched between 2014 and 2018. And that's a faster rate of production and on a scale larger than any other comparable vessel since the end of the Cold War. And between 2014 and 2018, China launched more naval vessels with a total greater tonnage, or total tonnage greater than the tonnage of the entire French, German, Indian, Italian, South Korean, Spanish, or Taiwanese navies. So it's important to remember, of course, that these vessels are just for the PLA Navy, and I haven't even included the shipbuilding numbers for the Chinese Coast Guard, of which Colin just gave an excellent presentation on, which has also benefited from an equally impressive shipbuilding program. And the Navy ships are being built in larger numbers, but they're also comparatively larger than their predecessors in size, meaning they can accommodate more modern weapon systems and sensors and more of them in general. And lastly, of course, I'd argue that the PLA now has access to a much better grasp of maritime domain awareness as well within its region and near seas. For example, on the Chinese occupied features in the South China Sea, the last time I counted, China had built a suite of over 40 radar installations of different types across these features. So in general, we're looking at a PLA that has greater resources at hand to project power in the way that the CCP has deemed it should. Now, does this mean that with the heightened tensions around Taiwan, we're likely to see a Taiwan scenario become reality soon in military terms? I would argue that this isn't necessarily the case. Shipbuilding, of course, is one thing, but translating larger quantities of more advanced vessels into true naval combat power and capability is another thing altogether. This requires years of operational experience, of which the PLA does not have much, of course, and greater leveraging of technical capabilities and a clear command and control structure as well in place, in addition to, of course, hiring and retaining more qualified and better trained manpower. So the weakness of the PLA, the last time I discussed this with the PLA itself, it was not just, of course, the Navy, but across all service branches, really comes down to inexperience in the personnel of the PLA. We therefore see an ongoing professionalization effort that is still very intensive, and I think will continue to take a few years to mature. The PLA, of course, has become more confident despite all of this. We see that trainings are becoming more varied and more complex. For example, these include night landings on aircraft carriers, training in complicated weather, so fog, low visibility, etc., and at night, training further away from China's coast waters, with exercises past the first island chain, training in joint operations with the Navy, the Coast Guard, Naval Aviation Forces, and the Air Force. And of course, we've seen the first batches of newly trained naval aviation pilots come through their first tour of 4 years of training, and continued efforts remain to recruit greater numbers for China's planned carrier groups. But doubts in the PLA, I think it's really important to underline, are still reported as to their ability to think through, train, and launch complex naval operations, according to Chinese sources. For example, a recent article in the PLA Daily quoted that the results of a meeting of a naval operations held by the PLA's Navy Submarine Training Center, in which their participants claimed that research into maritime tactics isn't deep and lacks insight into methods of tactical command. This meeting also found that the PLA Navy is still overly risk averse, and that battlefield training gives much consideration to safety, but little consideration to the enemy's circumstances. Lastly, PLA-linked online literature over the past year or so has also made clear that deciding to launch any offensive attack on Taiwan and risking fighting the United States would be akin to China throwing all of its eggs into one basket and really risking all the successes that it had built over the past decades. And for the CCP, I'd argue any attempt to reunite Taiwan with the mainland by force must be successful if decided upon or started, and the party could face existential questions at home. And so the larger political context is just as important here, and I think we need to remember that with regards to the PLA's modernization successes. Now, I wanted to spend the last few minutes raising the point that the possible intervention by the US and its allies in the region in a Taiwan contingency, as well as those allies willing and able from outside the region, will be incredibly important to either dissuading forced reunification attempts or in the event of an actual attempt to reunify the island by force. We've heard that the US Navy is now smaller in ship numbers than the total PLA Navy. And whilst this might be true, I think it's still important to qualify that. The US Navy still outstrips the PLA Navy in another term, and that's in total tonnage. So there's two sides to that story that we need to keep in mind. And as I explained previously, the PLA will require still years of training to become a fully operational and combat ready and truly integrated force. Nevertheless, of course, The leveraging of coalitions and coordination of militaries of like-minded countries will be important levers of power in the event of an actual military conflict with China. We recently heard that Japan has formally agreed that it will support the US in opposing coercion from China, including in a Taiwan scenario. And this is an important official statement, though not totally surprising. In the event of a Taiwan scenario, Japan will likely be drawn into the conflict, considering US Navy basing on its territory. Nevertheless, of course, this is a really important political signal that I think Japan and the US are sending to China. There's also been a lot of reporting recently, and I'll end soon, in the past few years about European powers becoming increasingly interested in looking at projecting power into the region and potentially playing a greater role in upholding the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. France, Germany, the Netherlands, in the last few years have published Indo-Pacific strategies. The UK has recently announced an Indo-Pacific tilt in its integrated review, with a carrier group led by the HMS Queen Elizabeth sailing to the region later this year, joined by American and Dutch vessels. But while these are positive signals that European powers are looking more towards the East and also thinking about how they can practically engage in the region, they are, of course, limited by the resources they have to do so. So if we just think about total principal surface combatants, according to the IISS military balance, China has 80, France has 22, the UK has 21, Germany has 10, and the Netherlands has 6. So with an increasingly assertive Russia on the one hand and assertive China on the other hand, European powers, I think, will be stretched and will have other priorities in their immediate neighborhood to consider, as well as potentially looking towards the East. So what does all of this really leave us with? Just to sum up, a PLA Navy that is larger, more modern, and equipped with more advanced weaponry than ever before. A PLA Navy that's supported with political will to improve on its weaknesses in the next few years, and in doing so will become more confident. And a slow but building pressure around the PLA's Taiwan mission. The US, of course, will therefore continue to be an important and much needed security provider in the region, with a growing but still very weak European allied presence. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nowens. Now we'll have Professor Ross. You're muted, Professor Ross.
You're muted. Here we go. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As I mentioned to our organizers earlier, as a Tufts alum, I remain loyal, and pleasure to talk to the students. Artem raised the critical issues at the beginning of this seminar. China as more assertive, more rising, larger Navy. What does it mean for the United States and the local powers? And I want to walk through these issues and try and how we think about China. How we think about China as a rising power. And of course, there are two ways to think about this. One way is if this would be a Washington view. And a Washington view would be, what's China doing in the United States and how should we respond? And if you work within the the DC culture and the DC sociology, you're going to want your assessments to resonate with the policymaking community. To use the term, you want to be relevant to policymaking. So you're going to adopt vocabulary which will resonate with politicians and policymakers. The other perspective that you might want to develop is as a political scientist, someone who studies politics, not who is a policymaker. No one hopes our policymakers understand politics, but that's not always the case. But nonetheless, as those who are outside the Washington community, we tend to study great power politics, international politics, and thus we tend to see China as an actor. And that's what I want to talk about today, how we understand China within the realm of international politics. And so that first perspective is, well, what do we have with China? Well, we have two things. We have China as a great power. Let's make no mistake about it. China is now a great power. It is no longer a rising power. In East Asia, we now have a bipolar region. Going on at least 5 years ago, the US Navy was unprepared to fight a surface war in the South China Sea, simply too dangerous. The Taiwan Strait, the Americans assume in planning for a war in the Taiwan Strait that they will be inferior to China within the Taiwan Strait and the Taiwan theater. reflecting both the Chinese Navy and, of course, their land-based surface-to-air missiles and their land-based medium-range, intermediate-range missiles. So this is now a great power, all right? So we want to understand China as a great power, and we want to understand China both as a rising power because it has objectives as a great power that reflects the fact that it's been rising over the past decade or so. So the first thing we want to understand is what is China's perspective that informs its objectives? Well, we should be clear. China's perspective is one based on security. It's an actor in international politics. And since 1949, October 1st, 1949, it has been surrounded by US air and naval bases. Air and naval bases in Korea, Japan, the Philippines, de facto base in Singapore, Changi, Subic and Clark in the Philippines, using basically Port Klang in Malaysia as naval bases and air bases. So to put it bluntly, the United States Navy and Air Force has encircled China's coastal waters since 1949. And it has treated the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and until recent years, the Yellow Sea as an American lake. Go in and out as you want. That is simply unacceptable to a great power, period. So when you think of Chinese ambitions, what do they want to do? Well, it's quite clear. They want to do what any rising power would want to do that was not at the table when the United States created spheres of influence that it dominated the waters. It wasn't there because it was weak. It's now strong. It wants to reorder the security system so to give it greater security. What does that mean? It wants to challenge US alliances. It wants to weaken US alliances. It wants to weaken US dominance of the waters on its perimeter. That's this building the Navy we heard about. And it wants to weaken US ability to use the air and naval bases around the perimeter of Chinese coastal waters to threaten Chinese coastal security and ultimately Chinese land-based security as well. This is normal. This is not aggressive. This is not a belligerent. This is not even expansionist in a normative sense, although it is expansionist. It wants to expand its influence. But what do you expect? You expect a power that's now the size of the Chinese Navy to say, oh, we're going to accept the 1950 series of influence where the Americans dominate our coastal waters and treat the South China Sea as an American lake. No, unacceptable. So regardless of what you hear in the Washington community, this is what you expect great powers to do in international politics. Beginning and end of story. This is normal. The next question you want to ask about China is, well, what about the policies they're using to achieve those objectives? And you hear the word belligerent, aggressive. Well, we live in a world where the words belligerent and aggressive are value-laden terms. Belligerent and aggressive compared to whom? Well, we have two bases of standards. Compared to rising powers in the past, certainly less belligerent and aggressive than American gunboat diplomacy and occupations and regime change in Latin America in the late 1890s and early 2000s, early 20th century. Much less aggressive. Certainly much less aggressive than Nazi Germany, World War I Germany. Certainly much less aggressive than a rising power Japan throughout the 20th century. And certainly much less aggressive and belligerent than the United States policy since the end of the Cold War in the Middle East. The United States has attacked Syria, attacked Iraq, attacked Afghanistan, attacked Iraq twice, I should say, attacked Libya, supporting, going into Yemen, right? Forces in Morocco, went into Bosnia, and since the end of the Cold War, overthrew the government in Panama as well. Let's be clear. I looked it up the other day. I think it said 7 million refugees pouring out of Syria since the United States targeted Syria and the war in Syria. Those refugees, almost 90% of the results of the US aerial campaign over Syria. China has not killed a single person with its military since 1989. It has not invaded a country or an air attack on a single country in East Asia since 1989. It's not used its Navy to attack another country's ship since 1989. In the realm of great powers who are seeking to revise a regional order, to give itself greater security and to challenge the alliances of a great power and to exercise greater sway over its coastal regions, be it the Gulf of Mexico, be it Central America, be it South America, be it Germany and Southeast Europe or Eastern Europe, and be it China, East Asia. This is really, in the realm of great power politics, this is really benign. Having said that, that doesn't mean it's acceptable to other countries, because this is a major challenge to American security, a major challenge to Japanese security, a major challenge to Philippine security. Just because it's challenging another country's security doesn't mean it's belligerent, doesn't mean it's aggressive. It means another country is more powerful and says we want more security, and we're going to use our military capabilities in ways to enhance our security. And yes, in international politics, it is a zero-sum world. So if China wants more security, other countries, particularly the United States, are going to experience less security. So what is China doing with its Navy? Well, as others have said, its Navy and Coast Guard and what have you are spending an awful lot of time in the waters near the Philippines, an awful lot of time in the waters near Malaysia and Singapore and Vietnam and South Korea and the Yellow Sea, and their Navy's there all the time. And what's that Navy saying? We're now here, we're now powerful. Better start respecting us. These countries don't need China to act out. They don't need China to start killing people. They can read the balance of power. They can see the United States is now no longer the dominant power. And what are they going to do? They're going to put their finger up in the air. They're going to see which way the wind is blowing, and they're going to accommodate the rise of China so China doesn't attack them with their air force. So China doesn't attack them with their Navy. So China doesn't use force and kill their fishermen. Because they don't trust the United States as much as they did before, because they don't trust the United States because the war to defend the Philippines would be far more costly, so maybe we won't do it. And second, if we do it, well, you know, it's that old Asian expression, Taiwan's going to die if there's a US-China war over Taiwan. The Philippines are going to suffer. Singapore will sink if there's a South China Sea war, right? So their objective is to stay out of a war. So what are the implications of the United States? The implications are very clear. America's losing its allies. They're gone. They're worthless. We can no longer count on using Chang'e in Singapore during a war, because one, we can't get in with our surface ships, and two, Chinese intermediate range ballistic missiles can destroy Chang'e in a day, and we'll repair it and they'll destroy it the next day, and we'll repair it and they'll destroy it the third day. And if there happen to be American ships in that harbor where they launch their DF-23Cs, those ships die too. Same with Subic and Clark, same with Klang, same with the ports in South Korea and the airfields in South Korea. Those alliances that give American naval and air facilities in the South China Sea are now worthless as strategic assets to the United States in war. And we're losing our allies as political partners because Singapore's out front saying we're not taking sides and it's up to America to find